Speak.
Hello, everyone. We will start in 3 minutes, 2 minutes right now. Buenos dias, bon dia, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are located. My name is Carolina Suarez. I am the CEO of the newly established Latin American Network of Venture Philanthropists and Social Investors. And today we have the privilege of opening our first inspirational talk with Harvey Koh and the extraordinary moderation from Alejandro Alvarez. Harvey is an exciting and internationally acclaimed practitioner and thought leader. So we will start right now. Alan will help us with the slides. So just some rules to remember to all of you. Please use the chat box to complement information or to ask your questions. Please limit your participation at the end of this webinar to 1 minute. If you are not speaking, please mute your micro. And just to remember that the session will be recorded. So welcome once again. Okay, so here our speakers. Harvey Koh is, as I mentioned, he's a practitioner. He born in Malaysia and right now he lives in London. He worked for Monitor, and as part of Monitor, he was co-author of 2 reports, amazing reports for the impact investment and inclusive business industry, bridging the pioneer gap and from blueprint to scale, which made a case for collaboration along the whole continuum of capital that he will explain later in his presentations. Harvey also designed and implemented one of the earliest and most ambitious affordable housing schemes in India. He was also part of the private equity foundations, one of Europe's first venture philanthropy funds. And right now at the FSG, he's fully dedicated to the development of inclusive businesses for impact. Lastly, just to mention and to highlight that he is a board member of our sister network in Asia, AVPM. Alejandro Alvarez, the next slide, please, Alan. I also welcome Alejandro Alvarez, co-founding partner of the International Venture Philanthropy Center, IVPC, a platform to advance venture philanthropy and social investment globally, and board member of Latin Impacto, our network, and he has been leading the creation of this network during the last 2 years. Alejandro, previously to join IVPC, he was the Inter-American Development Bank's representative in Europe, and he was also a partner and member of the Monitor Group. And earlier he worked as a consultant at the World Bank Group's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Alejandro is a national of Germany and Spain and currently lives in China. But as we know, those that know him, we know that he has an enormous passion for Latin America. So before giving the floor to Alejandro and Harvey, please let me share a quick overview of our nascent network, Latin Impacto. So maybe the next, yes. For those of you, maybe it is the likely first time you hear from Latin Impacto. We formally started the network at the beginning of this year with the leadership of distinguished leaders from the social investment sectors. Some of you are here today with us, with the support from the IVPC, and we created this network after 2 years of due diligence. Latin Impacto is a community of philanthropists and social investors that connects and mobilizes capital, and we understand capital like human, intellectual, and financial capital, committed to achieving more and lasting positive social and environmental impact. Next, please. Thank you. As you can see, we are part of a global movement in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin Impacto follows the role models of our sister networks in these regions. And these networks in Europe and Asia carry more than 1,000 organizations who are members of these networks, plus those engaged in Africa by EVPA. So we are part of this movement, and in this slide you can see the reason that ratifies the missing gap that we aim to cover with Latin Impacto. So first, we aim to connect the entire continuum of capital, from philanthropic grants to the full market rate return impact investment, including talent and intellectual capital. We also seek to connect providers of capital across all silos, from foundations, corporates, investors, family offices, professional services, academia, and public sector. As you know, there are associations within each of those segments, but none across them. Third, we promote the most investment approaches to achieve impact first. So we encourage a rigorous social deployment of the catalytic capital following the principles of venture philanthropy in order to generate significant social impact, applying approaches and tools from private equity and venture capital. Fourth and fifth, but finally and not least significant, we connect, as I mentioned, to the largest community of global social investors. We are an independent network, part of the global movement, and we connect to the largest community of global social investors. So our ultimate goal of Latin Impacto is creating more positive social and environmental impact through the facilitations of connections, sharing information and best practices, and mobilizing more capital towards impact. Next. Right now, my last slide, I just want to focus, actually my favorite one, is to explain more about the approach, our approach regarding how we aim to support the social ecosystem through the continuum of capital. In Latin Impacto, we are looking forward to leveraging a range of investment practices from philanthropic grants, as you can see here, to the full market rate return impact investment, including talent and intellectual capital. We understand that investors can leverage its practices by supporting the needs of social purpose organizations at different growth stages and structuring their portfolio for maximum impact. Therefore, this spectrum is one of our guiding principles where we understand the importance of improving the investing for impact approach. And I'm sure that Alejandro and Harvey will deep later in detail. With this quick overview of our network, we can see how we are building Latin Impacto as a platform to collaborate with existing ecosystem players to fill the gap that we are seeing in our region. I'm sure, next please. Yes, I'm sure that the dialogue that we will listen today between Harvey and Alejandro will help us to understand better the relevance of the concept in practice from someone like Harvey that has extraordinary broad and rich perspective on topics that are relevant to improving social impact. Now, I invite Alejandro, who will continue inspiring us and moderating the conversation. And once again, I welcome you to enjoy this session, and please add your questions in the chat box. Alejandro will include them at the end of his session. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Carolina. Good morning, everybody in Latin America. Good afternoon, those in Europe. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for your time and space, and I wish all of you good health in these very challenging times for all our regions. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to have this conversation with Harvey, who is not only a friend, and we go back to times when we both worked at Monitor Group, an American consulting firm, but also because he is a very renowned and respected international thought leader and practitioner. To the point, I was reminiscing before that some years back, I was attending the Skoll World Forum, and some people identified me as a former Monitor consultant, and everybody kept on coming to me to congratulate me on these amazing seminal piece of thought, from blueprint to scale and beyond the pioneer. Assuming that I had been a co-writer, I always had to reluctantly admit that that these were the other more talented guys. It was Harvey and Ashish and others who created this. But this is just to illustrate that their thinking was really shaped the industry of inclusive business, impact investment at that time. And the reason why we wanted to invite Harvey to this is because he has a very transversal view on a number of issues that we're addressing, working on in Latin America through Latin Impacto, as Carolina said, from philanthropy to impact investments, how to develop inclusive businesses, how to deploy catalytic capital, how to work along the continuum of capital, and also how to work across boards, networks. I mean, Harvey is part of the AVPN board. He collaborates with the GSG and with a number of other organizations. So he's an incredibly transversal view. And he's been working very extensively on innovating in models that help create and scale up impact, which is exactly what Latin Impact is trying to facilitate in Latin America. By doing one, helping surface those best practices in Latin America. There are very many best practices in the region that there's just not enough awareness about it. And also by stimulating the discussion and bringing new ideas through people from outside the region, friends like Harvey Koh, who have very relevant experiences in other places. So those are the reasons why we invited Harvey, why I'm so delighted to be here in this conversation. And to start the conversation, Harvey, because your trajectory is so extensive, I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about your personal journey. You covered different aspects of what I call the social impact industry. How did you do this? How was your journey, not only geographic but personal in exploring? Because I want our audience to get to know you a bit better as a person.
Great, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Carolina and Latin Impacto, and great to see all of you online. Thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here. As I was thinking about this, I thought it might be good to just, to go in order and sort of talk about where I started and all the different steps that I took, because actually from each step of the journey, as I was discussing with Alex earlier this week, I probably learned something different. And today I was reflecting on the title of the session. I don't know if anyone noticed that it said, "What not to do." And I always think that's such a great thing. That's what you want people to tell you, right? So like, what did you do wrong? What mistakes did you make that you hope other people won't? And I thought maybe I could just try to weave those in as I go through the journey. And I should say that my what's not to do are not really sort of you know, in some ways I have no credibility telling other people what you should or shouldn't do. But I think if I had to write a note to my 20-year-old self and say, by the way, don't do these things, you know, in the next 23 years, probably I would list some of the things that we'll talk about today. So I'll just try to weave those in. So maybe where I'll start is, you know, I worked in consulting, to start my career there at Monitor Group with Alex. From that, you know, the venture philanthropy scene at the time, this was the early 2000s. That was just starting in Europe. It had been well established in the US for some time. And some of the kind of pioneering foundations, so the one foundation that I ended up working with, we did some pro bono work for them initially, and then I joined them as an advisor on their team. And this was set up by a guy called Declan Ryan, who was one of the founders of Ryanair, who actually is now involved, I think, in aviation in Latin America through Viva Air. And it was such an exciting, I think for me, kind of exposure to not just the world of philanthropy, but a new way of doing philanthropy. You know, at the time, venture philanthropy was new. This idea that philanthropy is not just about meeting immediate needs, but also trying to change long-term conditions, trying to achieve systemic change, not just funding projects within organizations, but actually building organizations and trying to change sectors, right? This was a totally new direction in philanthropy. And so it was really exciting to be working with a foundation that was just being set up at the time, to figure out how they could really do this. You know, how can you use money, not just money, but also your thinking, your skills, your expertise, your connections, you know, to help build really strong organizations, which at the time were in Ireland and in Vietnam, but I was working mainly on the Irish organizations. And so that was incredibly eye-opening. And they were one of, I think, the founding members of EVPA in Europe. And then from there, I went to, you know, so I spent a few years as an advisor to them. And then I came back to London and helped set up something called the Private Equity Foundation, which has been referenced. And this had been set up by, you know, Blackstone, KKR, TPG, a whole bunch of private equity firms, together with their advisors, their lawyers, consultants, you know, all in support. And the idea was, you know, could we use the money and the skills of this private equity community to, again, build up really high performance, promising nonprofits and social enterprises, mainly working with disadvantaged young people, and really get them to scale. And for me, this was the switch from being an advisor to actually, you know, we now need to build and direct a venture philanthropy portfolio. We need to get the money out. We need the change to happen. And that was a whole journey in itself. This was, you know, the mid to late 2000s. And for me,
Harvey,
and I think maybe this, yeah, sure.
I'm sorry to already start interrupting you, but I wanted to double click the one and saying, and what was your experience in seeing the private equity approaches being deployed for social impact, right? The venture philanthropy model, which is has many dimensions, but one is applying that rigor, discipline. What was your experience? How do these two worlds work together? You know,
yeah.
Do they fit together, and what scenarios do they fit more than others? No, what was your experience in that?
It's a great question. I think, you know, so some pieces fit and some pieces didn't. Even when they did fit, I think it always took quite a bit of work to figure out how they did intersect, right? And help the people coming in from both sides of that dialogue, how, you know, even to make sense of each other, because often they were speaking very different languages. I think what did fit was the orientation towards building and scaling organizations, right? So I could get people to understand who are coming into it from private equity, you know, a lot of this will feel a bit like, you know, building and scaling a business. We have to think about, you know, what capital they need, what skills they need, what leadership they need, what systems they need. We need to think about their strategy for growth. We need to think about, you know, how we fund it, and how we fund it actually in a way, you know, even though we were providing grants to these organizations, the way I described it to our private equity sponsors was, you know, it's essentially medium-term growth capital, right? The difference is that, you know, you're not going to have ownership in the organization in a formal way and you don't get returns, but actually we should think about how it's going to be used in that way. And I think that all helped to make sense of it. We also over time realized that, you know, we realized kind of some sweet spots for us. So we realized that where we went into a nonprofit that had some kind of market-based component, right? So often they would have some grant funding and fundraising, but also they would sell services to schools or to local government. And that's where we could be really useful, because we could say, oh, you know, think of this like a market. It's a different sort of market maybe from what you're used to, right? But think of it as a market, and then we can, you know, we can bring in the skills to help you think about your marketing strategy, think about, you know, the team you need to build, and how to, you know, message, communicate to your target customers and so on. So that was all good. And also we were able to fund some really smart things. So I think one of the things that I always like talking about is, you know, we love getting leverage on our funding, right? So if we put money in, we'd like to see a return, even if it's not for us, but for the organization. Funding fundraising was, you know, the favorite thing. By the time we got to midway, I thought we need to do this for every single, you know, investment that we made, because we always made, you know, at least sort of 4x return on paying for fundraisers, because that was always really constrained and no one else would ever want to fund fundraisers. So we were, you know, when we went in, normally there was a huge untapped potential for getting further incremental funding. So those are all good. The pieces I think that were, and this is not just from private equity foundations, but also from one foundation, is I think there was a whole lot of learning that needed to happen in both directions, right? And this maybe is leading me to my first sort of what not to do. I think there had been a myth, or has been a myth that's developed, a lot of it in the venture philanthropy world, that this is about business teaching, you know, philanthropy and nonprofits how to be more efficient, more effective, you know, to be more impactful. And whilst I think there were many things that we brought up in the business world that with adaptation could be useful in the venture philanthropy world and by our portfolio organizations, it was never a sort of straight copy and paste, you know, always needed to be adapted. And more importantly, there was a lot of learning in the other direction, right? So there was a lot of new stuff about social change, right? Which for me, coming from the business world, was so much more complex than anything I'd ever encountered in the business world before. And you have to have a degree of humility, you know, coming into it, but also be willing to learn about social change and systems and complex systems and why those can be difficult to move. You know, most of the businesses that I'd worked with actually were happy to not change the system, right? You're playing within established systems, so you don't really have to think about the system very much. But when you're trying to change the system in some way, it becomes much more complex. And so there was a lot of learning. And so that was true with Private Equity Foundation. You know, many of those people from private equity, and I was actually surprised by the number of people from the industry who were really passionate about this, you know, but those who then stayed with us over the course of years, then over time learned much more about what it took to achieve social change. They were probably surprised by the timescales involved in many of those kinds of changes, and also the degree of difficulty, and also the lack of resource, right? So not just money, but just the lack of human capital, right? Carolina made the point about different types of capital. Just to get the right levels of talent and skills into this sector was huge. And I think for me, that was a big part of saying, do you know what? I'm only one person, but I am going to make that switch. You know, I'm going to sort of put whatever skills I have at the disposal of these really tough problems, rather than in the mainstream business world.
That's excellent. Thank you, Harvey. And I don't want to interrupt you on your journey. I simply wanted to double click there. And there's a lot of themes have resonated. I was also thinking that this realization about the two-way learning has become very strong. And our partners at EVPA have created a whole series about the lessons that we learned from the social purpose organization or the social entrepreneurs that we that we work with, that we partner with, no? Because there was this realization there's a lot of, you need to treat them as partners, as peers, because there's a lot of learning coming that way, right?
Right.
So that
and I think,
resonates.
then back then, this what would have been, early 2000s, mid 2000s, that was probably kind of a bit of an aha. I would hope that nowadays it's less of an aha. I think part of why people could fall into that trap back in the day was because we assumed that everything we were doing in business was good, and I feel like we are in a different moment today in terms of the public discourse, where maybe that assumption about, everything that we have ever done in business is good is not a safe assumption, so hopefully we're starting from a better place already in terms of actually, okay, maybe we need to rethink some of these assumptions. But so, I had a fantastic experience of building this portfolio at PEF. But one of the frustrations that I had was that our board, and again, this is, I probably think a comment about the time as well, were all investment professionals in private equity, and didn't really want to blur the line between the philanthropy and the business side of things. And so for them, the demarcation was, we're going to make our money over here with the businesses, and then we're going to give our money over here to create some good. What I was interested in was, like, what's the intersection between those two things? What about the good that you create with the businesses? And so that was really the next frontier for me. Now we call it, impact enterprise, social enterprise. Back in 2010, there was hardly anything happening on this front in the UK and in Europe. And so I thought, looking around the world, where's the stuff happening? It's India and, parts of Africa. That's kind of where the, a lot of it actually was happening in Latin America too. So I thought, instead of just sitting here in London, dreaming about it, let's go out to India. As it happens, a former colleague that Alex mentioned, Ashish Karamchandani, was leading some work that was sort of incubated by Monitor. It was called Monitor Inclusive Markets, and it was trying to build inclusive businesses, but also try to build inclusive business sectors in India. So housing was the big one that we were involved in for over a decade. But I went out to India to join Ashish and build the team that was going to be doing this. And, interestingly, because even though we're known probably internationally for the work that we've, the reports and so on that we published, because those pieces traveled outside of India, within India, we're probably known for our work in housing, because, that's what we spent our time doing. We, incubated companies, we advised, government, we advised investors, we, did community engagement, and, it was all, we helped developers look for sites, and, so there's all sorts of really deep work in building that sector. But for me, that was absolutely what I wanted to engage with, and from which I learned an awful lot. And so I think from that, I would say, one of the big things that was clear to me, not just from the housing work, but from the research that we then did into the microfinance sector, for instance, in India, which we think of as a, and the same in Latin America, we think of these as sort of huge commercial successes. They've got to some level of scale, but we don't think about how long they took to get there, right? And so one of the data points that we pulled out in, one of those reports was Grameen Bank, which was basically the pioneer of the MFI model, microfinance model in South Asia. It took them 17 years to get to break even, right? But then you look at Equitas, which was a much later entrant, 2007, they took 1 year to break even, right? So there were all these learning effects over time that meant that you could build a whole sector if you supported the pioneers to really develop and perfect their models. And the huge challenge that we were seeing was that there was a lack of really patient, flexible capital that could support those pioneers and say, there's potential here. We don't know if you're going to be commercial or, kind of feasible just yet, but we're going to back you and we're going to accept that high level of risk. And so this is, the work that we did around the Pioneer Gap. We were saying, actually, we need more investors, not only to go into the scale parts of the journey, you know, where it's a safer bet, but to go into the early stage where it's highly risky, you know, the payoffs are uncertain. It's something that I'm still working on today, having started that, you know, nearly 10 years ago. But that's still a huge need.
Harvey,
Yep.
Thank you for raising that, and sorry to interrupt you again, but that is it's a very important piece, and it's also very relevant in Latin America. And I was wondering whether you could maybe illustrate one example, no? Because Latin Pacto, one of the things we're advocating for very strongly is that for the need of those players who supported the pioneers, and there's patient or more concessionary types of capital that come hand in hand and work then along the continuum of capital with other more traditional investors, no? And that's one area which you've identified, you've spoken about a lot, and I think it's a universal need and opportunity. And I wanted to invite you to illustrate one example where you guys have worked that out, if you can share that. No? I mean, there's a great deal of interest in that.
I mean, there are so many examples. I think the example of microfinance probably is still, you know, I mean, it's a good one because everyone sort of knows of it and it's familiar. I always have to preface everything by saying I'm much more familiar with the MFI sector in South Asia than I am with the sector in Latin America. Obviously, they sort of grew up in, you know, on sort of parallel tracks. But if you look at, you know, and this is what's interesting about the continuum of capital chart that Carolina put up earlier, where we had sort of different kinds of organizations. If you look at the MFI sector in South Asia, it actually moved along the continuum, right? When it first started, it was NGOs. You know, Grameen is an NGO. The early pioneers who brought the model from Bangladesh to India were all NGOs, mainly focused on rural livelihoods, right? Their idea was, how can we support people to have better rural livelihoods? Oh, they need credit, right? So here's this great microcredit model based on joint liability group lending, and, you know, we can do that. And so the kind of funding that they needed at that time was grant, right? And so you could only provide grant at that point to them. And then at a certain point, it then got to the point where, you know, they couldn't scale very much because there wasn't enough grant funding. And so at that point, there was then a number of different innovations. One of them was conversion of these NGOs into non-bank financial companies and capitalizing them so that they could actually grow as businesses. That was one. Interestingly, the other sort of innovation that happened was a policy change. So the government, influenced by one of the industry associations, sector associations, said that this should be one of the priority sectors for banks to lend to, and they had certain requirements for priority sector lending. And so there was an incentive for banks to start lending. And then one of the banks then stepped up, ICICI stepped up and said, oh, you know, we have a way of doing this where actually we can lend through specialized vehicles to these lenders, but, you know, sort of in a way off balance sheet for the lender. And so it was an easier way to sort of funnel funding to these entities on lending. And this combination of factors then caused this whole thing to just, you know, skyrocket. And then we see what we normally hear about in terms of story from South Asia, which is commercial VCs coming in, the IPO of SKS, you know, it becoming a very mainstream, you know, kind of stock market investment. You know, those are just the very last bit of the story, right? And so for me, what's really interesting is if you look at this continuum, and I think the additional point with this is sometimes the continuum happens over time rather than all at once, right? This bit that's like all this commercial capital coming in, which I agree is like the largest source of scale capital, it could not have come in at the beginning of the journey, right? We needed something else to go in and build it, and that was grant, you know, and then it was sort of, you know, more sort of softer capital, but that was kind of regulatorily advantaged to go in there, and then you had the commercial capital come in. Now, one caveat is that, you know, people have argued that actually some of the impacts of the commercial capital come in were also not managed very well. so that led to overheating, that led to a crisis of Andhra Pradesh in India. So I think there's also a question of when you progress along the continuum, how you bring in new sources of capital, how do you evolve the models and the structures and regulations so that you avoid some of these risks, right? So all of these need to happen. But actually, I think it's a great story of how, certain people providing the right kinds of capital at the right time were really key. The other thing I will say, because this relates to the continuum of capital, but also to the process of scaling is, and this is true of MFI, but also of the housing work that we did, is that many of the barriers to scaling were not just at the level of the business, but were in the ecosystems around the business, right? And so this is something that we've written extensively about and worked extensively on. And this actually came to us from our housing work because, we were working with these housing developer companies and thinking, why aren't they scaling? Well, they're not scaling because it's very hard to get, approvals. It's a very corrupt housing approval system. The subsidies are not flowing properly that should be going to these areas. They're not getting the investment. They're not getting the finance. No one's building awareness amongst customers, about low-income customers, about this as an option for them, right? So it's all landing on the companies to do the sort of pre-competitive market building as well as operate and run their business. So we thought that's the role that we and others should be playing, right? So we called it industry facilitation. What are the things that we need as sometimes funders, sometimes, non-profit facilitators coming in to say, let's try to build the ecosystem. And then what we realized as we, kind of developed this idea was actually, if you look at all these impact sectors, that we've worked on or looked at, whether it's energy access or microfinance or safe drinking water or sanitation, they all have this. You will find scaling barriers at the firm level, but also you'll find them at the value chain level, the government policy level, the public goods level. And you can't scale, unless you really work on those barriers. And it's too hard for the companies themselves in most cases to really, dismantle those themselves. And so this was really key for us in terms of saying, if you want to scale, you need to be ecosystemic in your approach. And that happened with MFI. Just to go back to that with microfinance, the organizations, so Sidby Foundation and DFID and some other players, FWWB, who are funding the early pioneers directly, were also funding the industry associations, that campaign for the policy change on priority sector lending, right? So all these pieces end up linking up together.
Thank you, Harvey. Super interesting. And I think a lot of that is relevant, and some of it will resonate as well with Latin America, where there was also a remarkable development of the MFI sector, also with a lot of support. And so very, very interesting themes. And I think they're relevant across the board. We're pressed for time, and I'd love to spend hours on each of these topics with you. Wanted to invite you to maybe wrap up your journey also with some of your learnings about the do's and don'ts. Along, maybe you can dedicate 3-4 minutes to that, and then we will try to bring in some other questions from other people as well, and have a little bit more interactive session.
Sure. So yeah, I think to go back to sort of my notes to my 20-year-old self about what not to do, I would say, my experiences working with enterprises and sectors in India and Africa, and then with investors now, has been a lot of rethinking, right? So I think there's something here about not assuming that what, a community needs or what an enterprise needs, or even worse, assume that what you have to offer them must be what they need. And it seems such a simple point to make, but we see people fall into this trap all the time, right? So with communities, it's projecting our own attitudes and motivations, particularly where middle class or metropolitan, on, people who are, lower income in a rural setting, in a different place, in a different context. And so I think there's always that watch out. But I think it also translates into the investment level, right? So the number of times we have seen the shortcomings of, you know, the well-established Silicon Valley VC model in impact enterprise, you know, is astounding, right? You know, the Silicon Valley VC model was developed in a very different context, you know, and it works with a certain kind of tech startup, essentially, that's going to be very fast scaling, high scaling. And so, funnily enough, when you try to apply that to a slower scaling, bricks and mortar, rural, you know, education or ag enterprise in, you know, one of the less developed states in India, it doesn't work, right? You can't get that hockey stick, you know, out of that, you know, in terms of the numbers. And so I think this is sort of the, you know, the key thing that has stuck with us from all that time, which is sometimes we need to rethink our assumptions about what's needed. And the most recent chapter probably in my journey is that, you know, all that work that we were doing in the Pioneer Gap from before has come under a new term now, I would say, and a new area of work, which a lot of people are calling catalytic capital. And this is, you know, and this fits into the continuum of capital idea in that it's neither grant money that you're giving away, nor is it, you know, fully commercial capital that you're investing. You are investing it, but you're prepared to be more flexible than you otherwise would be with risk and return, right? And that allows you to go into higher risk situations, right? Where the end destination is unknown, you know, whether there will be a payoff. To go into a less developed market or ecosystem where there are higher barriers and higher challenge and therefore more risk and more issues. To back a model that's not been proven yet, right? So you're taking more risk. And what's interesting when we've spoken to lots of investors about catalytic capital or those who are practicing it is mostly it's not about going in saying you're going to accept a lower return. Mostly it's about going in and saying, I'm going to accept higher risk without necessarily demanding a higher return to compensate me for that risk, which is what we'd normally do, you know, in the mainstream business world. And so I think this is what we need. Like we've looked at many, many sectors now. Our concern is that many of the solutions that we need to get to, and I think most of us would agree that we're still not there. Like, you know, we still need more solutions to be developed and scaled for the kinds of problems that are facing us. In fact, we need them more urgently than ever, right? But if we are very rigid in sticking to, well, these are the risk return expectations that I have from before, and I won't go in unless you meet these expectations, you know, from what we've seen, easily 90% of what's out there to be supported, you're not going to touch with a barge pole, right? And I think that needs to change, right? I think we're in a moment of urgency and need now with the world where, you know, unless we start, unless with at least some of our money and resources, we're willing to start with a problem and think about the potential solutions and then ask ourselves what's needed to advance those, right? And then adjust our expectations, right? And we're starting to see this happen, right? So we're seeing, so we have this great example. I won't show the slide, but in one of our pieces, you know, we covered lots of investors who are doing this catalytic capital work, and one of them is Prudential Financial, you know, in the US, you know, who are an institutional investor, but they recognize this problem and they actually carved out a portion of their capital to be catalytic. And they said, we're going to exclude this from our typical asset liability matching process so we can take more risk. And they've managed to use that to go into new markets where they don't know the risk and it's highly uncertain, and then prove those out. And then later on, you know, in many cases, they've been able to invest in the main portfolio. So I think if there's one sort of newer theme that I'd love for people to take away from this, it would be the discussion around catalytic capital, and we can go into that more if needed.
Thank you, Harvey. I mean, so many highly relevant and current and acute topics. I appreciate that. I wanted to open the floor now in the interest of time and respecting everybody's scarce time. To see whether there's any questions from our the participants in this call. This would be the time. We have about 10 minutes, and if you could keep the very, very short questions, and then Harvey, if you could also help with, you know, very quick soundbite answers, and then we can get more interaction. So any questions from the floor? I've so far not received any specific ones from through the chat. You can also speak up directly.
Yes.
Make it.
I have a question here, Jorge.
Hi, Jorge. Please go ahead.
Yes. How are you all? This is Jorge from Monterrey, Mexico. Very nice opportunity to meet you all, and thank you, Harvey, for your explanation. Just a quick question. Given the complexity and amount of challenges we do have in our countries in Latin America, based on your experience, how would you choose an area to work on? How would you choose a project or an initiative, given the so diverse challenges that we face in Latin America countries?
That's a great question. Okay, I'm going to do my best, Alex, do this quickly, but this is a huge question. I mean, I think what I would say you should not to just continue with the theme of what not to do. I don't think it's really possible to say this objectively is a much bigger problem than, you know, than something else. I mean, you can always measure it in terms of people or cost or whatever, but then you've chosen the metric, and by some other metric, you'll choose something else. I think, so there's a sort of head part of the answer and a heart part of the answer. I think the head part for me is always, well, where are you best placed to actually make an impact? You know, in terms of the resources that you have, and not just the financial resources, but the non-financial resources, you know. So in many cases, it's expertise, networks, influence, as well as the resources, you know, financial resources that you have. You know, where are those well placed to actually contribute to solving something? So a lot of my colleagues who are working in Latin America very actively work with corporations on shared value, right? So one of the things that we talk about, so how do corporations actually turn their businesses to actually achieving social good? First question is, well, you know, what are your assets as a corporation, right? Which communities are you really impacting, and in what ways? And then how do we use those to maybe then affect the kinds of things that we're interested in, right? So that's sort of the head and the rational part. I think there's also a heart part to it, which is, you know, at the end of the day, we are, you know, driven by sort of our interests and our passions. And I think this works at all sorts of levels. For individual investors, it is about, you know, your passions and your interests and where you feel most called. I think even for corporations, that's really key. You know, we've seen more and more companies feel that, or decide that this is a great way to start to engage more of their staff, you know, and to retain key staff and to build loyalty, maybe also customers, you know, it kind of depends how your industry is set up. But, you know, there is a part of like trying to figure out on a kind of personal, emotional level, you know, where people feel most connected. So I think it's probably a combination of those two things. And final thing is, as soon as you choose one of those issues, our experience is that you will then see the connections to other issues that you had not defined as your focus before, you know, because if you follow something deep enough through all the connections, you'll find it's connected to other things, which leads to the next set of issues around like where you're going to draw your boundaries, you know. So it's always a tricky balance. I think you have to be focused, but if you're working in education, you have to recognize the links to health and nutrition and, you know, all of those pieces. So I think it's recognizing both the focus as well as the connections to other areas where maybe you need to partner, you know, with others who are more expert and sort of link together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey. Any other questions from the floor?
We have a question from Agustin Landa. Agustin, welcome. Agustin, are you there?
Thank you, Carolina. Yes, Harry, this is quite interesting. I'm sorry I don't have the video. My connection is not very good right now. First, this is very interesting, and thank you for that. But what you were saying in a moment ago before Jorge's question is that in some way, we always have to have some resources kind of exploring new ways of doing things. And those should not have, we would say, have that level of risk. That is totally risk money. I mean, it's money to risk. It's like a company is doing R&D. Is that like the research and development of a company? This isn't a part that we don't see very often, even in foundations. They don't set up a money to one side to do, let's try new approaches to things. Let's try what are things going there. And either companies, specifically in social sectors or in social environments, there are not. So I just want, can you go a little bit deeper on that? Because I think it's a very powerful point and position that maybe even leads to some good businesses later on, or good some outcomes that you wouldn't get in other way.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. A lot of this is about essentially R&D, and you know, the example of Prudential Financial that I described earlier, they have described their catalytic portfolio as an R&D, you know, funnel essentially for new things that they would invest in from the main portfolio. I think what's interesting there is, you know, with everything, you know, if we think about an R&D sort of approach to this, and in the social space, you know, I mean, compared to doing R&D for, say, you know, kind of pharmaceutical therapy or something like that, which is something I've worked in before, it's, you know, the risks are more multifaceted and harder to pin down, right? With something that is thinking about social change and more systemic. So it's, I think we can take the same approach, but we have a different lens for thinking about what are the risks associated. And I think that is what leads me to say, depending on your risk appetite, you know, in each area that you're investing in, you will draw a different cutoff in terms of what kinds of things you will back. And so that's where I think, you know, the example of Prudential, saying actually there are some things which are more R&D, which are more known to us that we can go in from the main portfolio. And then there are some others which we have to do from this essentially sort of, you know, unmatched portfolio, unmatched pot of money, where we can take higher risk is really key. I also think it's a huge opportunity for philanthropy to step in, right? I struggle to remember who it was now, but there was a much wiser person than me wrote at one point that, you know, philanthropy is society's R&D, or should be, right? That philanthropy can take the risk, right? Because, you know, that money is essentially sort of, you know, doesn't need to sort of anchor to any sort of payback. In many ways is much more flexible than, say, public money, taxpayer money, right? So it can actually go put its money into newer models that then can be taken forward either by government, if it's more of a state, you know, public service provision model, or by mainstream investment capital, if it's more of a market-based model.
Thank you, Harvey. And we unfortunately have very little time for this super rich discussion. One last question from me, and then I wanted to pass it on back to Carolina, is you've worked around many very complex issues across different geographies, right? And each region has its complexity. We've heard about Latin America, incredibly diverse, complex region, Asia, India itself as one continent. What's your view, and I know there's not a blanket answer, but what's your quick perspective on how transferable are learnings and approaches, methodologies? There's no cookie cutter, but do you see patterns that can be leveraged? Because that's one of the things that we try to do with leveraging international networks and conversations like these.
Absolutely.
What's
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think, obviously the context and the particulars are always different depending on where you go. But I think, you know, the fact that we're seeing this global dialogue about, you know, the continuum of capital and social enterprise and, you know, shared value and all these things, you know, indicate that actually there are some themes here that cut across, right? The pioneer gap issue is something that I've seen literally in every sector that I've looked at, in every country that I've looked at. The need for catalytic capital is the same. So I think there's lots of things that do cut across for me. I also think there's potential for models, you know, to either sort of grow up side by side, as we saw with microfinance, or to actually move across, right? So I think earlier this week we were talking about sort of models that have moved between India and Mexico. You know, the Aravind Eye Hospital model has been replicated by Sala Uno in Mexico. And, you know, so I think there's sort of interesting movements in either direction. And probably, and you know that I spent some time working in with actors in Colombia and Mexico last year. The thing that I would caution against, and maybe this will be my last what not to do, is to believe that somehow the context you're working in is exceptional or exceptionally difficult, right? And I run into this all the time, particularly in Latin America. Like, well, you know, Latin America is so difficult. You know, no one wants to work with each other, and it's so complicated. And we know, you know, from those of us who've worked across different regions, every region has its own challenges, you know, and it's very hard to say, I think, that India, you know, doesn't have a high level of challenge or low level of challenge. So probably it's that, you know, obviously everything has to be adapted, but I certainly would say, you know, don't go into this thinking that Latin America is just the most difficult place to do this, because I'm pretty sure it's not.
I thank you very much, Harvey, and I share your perspective, having also worked across regions, and I keep on sharing that perspective. We have one more question, if you're allowed.
Yes, we have three questions. We have two questions. Three, okay. Actually. Juan Carlos Díaz de Bilbao, Pablo Gabriel Obregón, and Luisa Mariana Pulido. So here from Juan Carlos Díaz de Bilbao, I will read it because he has a good connection. So he asked me to read it. So Harvey, thanks for your presentation. For me, the Beyond the Pioneer report from 2014 was an eye-opener. Currently, I am familiar with the collective impact and systems change frameworks promoted by FSG. What would you say that are the main barriers to scale impact in contrast to the ones featured in the report mentioned before? What has changed? What is still persistent need?
Wow, this is a huge question. I think, and I haven't gone so much into the systems change part of our work with this conversation so far. I think as we've gone more into the systems change work, and this is our work to change market systems to be more inclusive, I think we've realized that the previous way that we sort of articulated this, which was, you know, the company is in the center, right? Or the investor is in the center, and you have to scale everything out, and you have to deal with the system so that the thing can scale. Maybe we're slightly backwards, you know, because if you look at the world today and you say, well, what is causing the problems in the world today? The problem is not just that certain companies are doing the wrong things or certain investors are doing the wrong things. The problem is actually the whole system is producing the wrong outcomes, right? If you think about what's causing poverty and inequality and environmental degradation, it is the way things are organized. So I think we've come into this from a slightly different way now, which is we're saying, actually, we should think about our companies, our business models, our investments as building blocks that help the system change towards something that's going to be functioning better, right? And that's it in a nutshell. If it's helpful, I can, you know, circulate some more materials on sort of what we mean by more inclusive economy. What are some of the ways in which we've been working with people to achieve that systems change? Or maybe that can be another webinar.
There's material for lots of webinars on this topic. Carolina, you had two more questions if we have time.
Yes, we're sure. Yes, we're aware that the time we finish at the time, but just two questions more. So, Pablo Gabriel, do you want to talk, please? Or Luisa Mariana?
Hi.
Hi, Pablo.
Lisa?
Yes, it's okay. Yes, perfect.
Go.
Okay.
We're not hearing
Lisa?
you, Pablo.
Yes,
Pablo
okay,
Gabriel.
right now. Now,
okay.
now it's with us.
Okay, no. Well, as you mentioned, Harvey, one obvious source of catalytic capital is philanthropy, but that's not where the big money is. So other than by leading by example and then bringing in commercial capital when you show success of some model, which can take too much time, how can we get commercial capital more quickly to take part into this catalytic capital part of the continuum?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of work now in terms of blended finance structures, you know, so I think what people are now trying to do is saying, instead of waiting for all this stuff to happen step by step and then, you know, wait for sort of serendipity as well to sort of play in and other investors to come in. let's create vehicles that can actually go into whole sectors. So we're seeing these being set up for, say the health sector in Africa, where we actually build a sort of, a structured vehicle, a layered structure essentially, where philanthropy can provide a sort of first loss layer. You then have catalytic investors who are willing to take more risk and, take some of the junior tranches. And then you can have, mainstream investors come in the senior tranches and have that sort of go into a sector and be able to invest over a suitably long time horizon to really build and scale those models. I will say, I mean, that's a way of kind of bringing different kinds of capital together across the continuum. I think it still will not work essentially for the models that are least well developed today, right? Because that will still require a very high level of risk tolerance to go in. But I think what we're now starting to see is that different kinds of actors who have the different kinds of capital are able to say, well, if I work in this area and I can provide some incubation support, and get some of these to an investable level, we can then line up, some of these larger investment vehicles to come in on the back of us. To some extent, it's also an issue with just intersectoral coordination, right? Because the kinds of players with these different kinds of capital sit in different sectors. You've got, aid donors, philanthropic foundations, institutional investors, who, kind of just come from some very different places. And I think we're just now getting, the first cohort of people across all these different sectors who have more facility in being able to speak each other's languages and be able to piece together these kinds of deals. So hopefully we can see more of that, but I would certainly say, that might be an interesting area to explore for Latin America.
Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question from Luisa Mariana, please. Luisa Mariana, welcome.
It will be, Harvey, thank you for your intake. I think the great notes, Alejandro, on what to do and what not to do that we can take as a learning process. I would go to how to bring in the capital, as Harvey said, at the right time, right capital at the right time in scaling and dismantling all the barriers. From your experience, it's very interesting to come from an advisor to an executor. How would you recommend the keynotes to go to that?
So how to make the transition from advisor to someone who's doing it?
Yeah, what would be your take, your principal notes on how to do it right? Because from being an advisor to being an executor, it's a different stage.
Completely.
And that has made, from your experience in the housing project, it was a great experience to how to become detached from being an advisor and on board and making and having the skills to make everybody work together.
Yeah. Wow, that is, again, another huge question. Thank you for that. I think the first thing to say is that all those shifts, in hindsight, maybe look a bit more intentional, but probably were a bit accidental, for the people that we were in the situation in which we were working. So we've started out as advisors in housing in India, but then realized that actually many of the kinds of things that we were trying to do couldn't be achieved unless we were willing to work at it over, multiple years and work with more players and work even when we weren't being funded on a project, right? So we kind of accidentally fell into that kind of work because we were really committed to seeing this happen. And also we fell into the systems, more systemic work, again, accidentally, because we realized the barriers weren't just with the companies, but also in the ecosystem. Probably the key thing that differentiates it all is whether you're going to stick your credibility and your success on whether the change happens or not, right? Isn't that the key? That's how it shifts. So we're not going to, success is not going to be about us providing good advice or, producing a good deck or writing a good report or whatever it is, right? Success has to be the sector changing over time and these people actually having access to something different over time. and their lives changing over time, right? So I think when we decided that our North Star was going to be, how many people in India, in the low income groups had access to and were able to tap into these new, better sources of housing and housing finance, that totally changed what we did, right? Because then we thought, okay, then all these other things that we do have to change, right? And then to your point, we had to bring in new types of people, so consultants who are very good at working on something for 3 to 6 months and thinking about it and analyzing it are not necessarily very good at maintaining relationships with housing developers over 5 to 10 years. Or at working with governments to think about how you can insinuate your way into, the right bureaucrats' offices and inform them and influence their policies. So we need to bring new people in. And that's something that continues even to this day, actually. We're continually finding, gaps in our capability, because we're having, especially when you're trying to work systemically, as well as be more of an implementer, you start to push into all these areas where a consultant with an MBA just is not well prepared in most cases, to really engage with these issues. And then also hiring people who've actually run businesses before. I mean, this is huge, or run organizations before, as opposed to only having sat on the other side as an advisor, because, as Alex and I probably remember from being consultants, everything is much simpler when you see it through the lens of a consultant. When you're actually in there and you're building it, there are so many more challenges and issues that are not clear to an advisor, but you see it when you're building the business. And that's probably the key thing. If we could have more people doing some of this facilitation and implementation who actually have experience of building this, have worked in the front line, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Harvey. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you, Alejandro. I think that this conversation has been very inspirational. I think we have felt our purpose. So thank you once again. It has been an enormous privilege to listen to your insightful experiences. It has been also terrific to have people connected from Mexico, Chile, Peru, Venezuela, Brazil, Peru. So it is our goal, how we can connect better our region. And I think this conversation is a showcase how we can strengthen the impact ecosystem to leverage significant social impact, particularly in the middle of these challenging times that we are living right now, and that we need to be more strategic than ever to make social investments to achieve great impact. Finally, I want to invite you to join us in our next events next week. On August 18, we'll have Fundación Santo Domingo, Fundación Lehman, and Fundación MedLife talking with Dalberg about the new strategies for philanthropy. And on August 10th, we will have a partnership with The Impact, and we will talk about how we can also to promote innovation and social investment through the continent of capital. So welcome to join us to these events next week, and please find more information on our webpage, latimpacto.org. So we are looking to continue in touch with all of you, and we will share the presentation and the recording link, and please check the chat. We invite you to visit the following link, the link that Alan has mentioned here for the evaluation and how we can improve our future events. So once again, thank you for your active commitment and collaboration. Harvey, thank you. We are sure that we should continue this dialogue, and we hope that you can join us next year once we can overcome this pandemic, and you can come to Latin America and to be part of us. And also Laura Maya from FSG, thank you very much for your support and commitment. So good morning for all of you, good afternoon, and good evening for Alejandro, actually. So have a good day, and thank you.
Thank you all around.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.